and welcome to another West Howe Community Enterprises cooking video. This week we're going to be making a risotto. It's going to be either a pea and bacon risotto or pea and mushroom, depending on your dietary requirements. And so I'm just going to tell you the things that I've got here that we need, and then we'll get started cooking. So few of the usual things: you need some vegetable oil or cooking oil. You're going to need salt and pepper for seasoning, and some mixed herbs, always good too. You're going to want quite a few stock cubes today, and some butter. I want it to be a really nice creamy dish. I've got some garlic ready chopped and a large onion, and we're going to put some little cherry tomatoes in here. I've got my peas, and I'm using mushrooms, so either mushrooms or bacon, both will work great. And then for the finishing touch, we've got our Parmesan cheese. You can use cheddar cheese, but Parmesan, just the flavour is stronger and it goes really, really well with a risotto. And of course, our rice. Now there is risotto rice available. You'll see it in boxes in the supermarket. It's usually called arborio rice, and it's a little bit more expensive. But we're going to make it today with long grain rice, just to show that you can do that too. It's obviously available more cheaply, so it just makes it a more sensible meal on a budget. So we're going to be using 500 grams of rice, and this should make about 6 portions. It's a delicious meal to have hot, but also one of the advantages of risotto is that actually the next day it tastes even better, and it's lovely cold, or you can just put it in the microwave and heat it up and have it again. So it's a really good meal to make in a batch, and you can freeze it too. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I've got my big pan over here. I'm going to put a bit of the oil in there and turn on a low heat. I said about 2 tablespoons in the description, but you can guess. You need to just cover the bottom of the pan with the oil. And we're also going to add a little bit of butter as well. We'll put a little bit of butter in now, and then we're going to add a little more later on, because we want, as I said, this to be really creamy. So for the moment, I'm just going to put a little knob of butter in here. And turning on a low heat, whilst that starts to warm up, I'm going to chop up the onion, and we want it to be in quite fine pieces. So as usual, we're going to take off the outside and then just create some small pieces of onion. I'm using a brown onion today, but white would be fine. You can use shallots if you've got shallots. I know some people grow those in the garden, and you could use a red onion too. It's just whatever you've got available. I have to throw everything away as I go along, because I've got a really small space that I'm working in. So it means I have to be extra tidy. So I'm just taking off the outside of this onion, because the outside layer is sometimes a little bit dry. And trying not to let my eyes get too sore. Okay, so if you have a way that you're happy with cutting onions, please ignore mine. This is just how I've got used to doing it, but I'm not advocating this as necessarily the right way to cut an onion. You might have seen somebody doing it properly. The main thing is the result at the end. You want some small pieces of onion and no pieces of finger. Like that. The other thing with risotto is you can put pretty much anything in a risotto. It's really just down to your personal preference. It's a really flexible meal. You can put most vegetables in there, and you can make it with chicken, that's quite popular. Chicken and mushroom. As we're doing today, bacon works well. You could pop some ham in there. I quite like to use courgette, and I think it's just about the texture, really. So I tend to use things that soften nicely in the cooking process so that it's a really nice soft meal. Don't really end up needing to chew it very much by the end. So it's quite comforting. So I've got all of my onion here, which I'm going to chuck into the pan. Okay. Give that a stir so that it gets coated with the oil and the butter. So you will, I don't know how well you can see this in the video, it's quite an oily mixture at the moment, which is good. Normally I would use a very small amount of oil with frying. You use sort of the bare minimum, but actually for a risotto, the butter and the oil, you want to really coat the onion at this stage. So I'm just going to leave that there for a moment just so that it heats up and starts to fry. Now at this stage, if you were using bacon, then you would be chopping up your bacon and popping that in now with the onions, because the bacon needs to just have a few more minutes to fry. We're not using bacon in mine, I'm using these mushrooms, but I'm going to give them a wash first because they've got little bits of mud on them. So I'll put you on pause while I wash my mushrooms and get those chopped up. Okay, so the onion there has just been cooking for about 4 minutes. As I say, if you have bacon, the bacon will be in there with the onion, and you just want to cook that for long enough for the bacon to sort of go to that nice brown colour. I'm just chopping up the mushrooms fairly small. You can leave the stalks on if you're using these. Just make sure that if they've got mud on, that you've taken that off, and just chop those up fairly small. In terms of quantity, you want really for 6 portions, which we're making today, you want about 12 rashers of bacon, or about 10 to 12 mushrooms, depending on the size, just as sort of a guideline. Oops. Go. It's important to just keep stirring this and just make sure nothing's sticking to the bottom as well. Nearly there. And one more. Brilliant, okay. Right, so I'm going to chuck the mushrooms in. At the moment they're huge, so they're going to take up loads of space. You'll find everything gets a bit smaller after it's been cooking for a few minutes. So don't panic if your pan looks a little bit full. But as I've said in previous weeks, if you don't have a really big saucepan, you can always divide your ingredients up between 2 smaller saucepans, or you can make the recipe with just half the amount of stuff, and then you'll just have 3 portions instead of 6. Okay, so let that sit for a minute. We're also going to pop in a spoon of garlic. As I always say, it's very much the quantity of garlic you want to put in is down to how much you like your food to taste like garlic. I've suggested a teaspoon in the recipe, which will just give a very, very mild background flavour. depending on your sensitivity. I'm going to put in a little bit more because I really like garlic. And give that a stir. There we go. And it's at this stage that we add the rice. So this is one of the things that's unusual about a risotto. You don't boil the rice cooks within all of the ingredients, so it picks up the flavour. So I've got 1,000 grams or a kilogram of rice here, so I'm only going to use half of this. So I'm just going to pour half of it into a sieve. If you're using risotto rice, like the arborio rice that you'll find in the supermarkets, you don't need to rinse that, but because this is just a plain long grain rice, it's usually a good idea to rinse it in a little bit of cold running water. So I'm pouring it into the sieve, and then I'm going to just do it over the sink, just to rinse it, to get some of the starchiness off the outside. Hopefully I won't get this all over the place, so I'm just using half of this bag. Obviously you can weigh this if you want to be a bit more precise than I'm being, but I've managed for a long time without scales, and they aren't essential by any means, unless you're baking a cake and you're being very precise. You don't really need to have scales. Okay, so I'm going to go rinse this. Okay, so the rice is going to go into the pan. Have a look first and just see whether it needs a little bit more butter or oil. So this is my pan at the moment. It's certainly not dry, but we do want there to be a reasonable amount of butter or oil to cling onto the rice. So I'm going to put a little bit more butter in. I'm going for another knob. Just pop that right on the bottom of the pan and just let that melt in. And then what we're going to do is fry this rice in the pan with the other ingredients for a couple of minutes so that it gets coated with the oil, and it's just going to start to look a little bit shiny, and the grains of rice, you will notice, will look a little bit translucent because they're absorbing the oil before they absorb any liquid. Give that a stir. And at this point you want a nice low heat so that everything's getting heated through and warmed, but you don't want it to be too hot because you don't want anything to stick to the bottom of the pan or burn. You just want things to be being gently warmed. So give that a stir. So at this point in your pan, you will have your onion and your rice and your garlic and your butter and oil, and then you'll either have some bacon or some mushrooms. That's going to just need a couple of minutes just to soak up all of that nice butter. So whilst that's happening, I'm going to put you on pause and boil the kettle because it's very loud. And the next stage is that we're just going to make up some stock to start to put into here. Okay, so I've started to make up the stock. I've been just stirring this pan while the kettle's been boiling. And as you can see, everything's all got a little bit smaller and all that lovely butter's been absorbed by the rice and it's smelling delish. This is the first cup of stock. So we want about a litre of stock, about 2 stock cubes, because we need a lot of liquid for the rice to absorb. So I don't have a measuring jug, so a trick that you can use is that a pint is about 568 millilitres. So you want just slightly less than a pint for each of the 2 stock cubes. So I put one of the stock cubes into the bottom of the pint glass and added a bit of boiling water and given it a stir, and then added the rest. And I'm going to pour some of the stock into here now. I'm going to do about a third of this glass. Okay, and give that a stir. Now the key with a risotto is that you want to just add the liquid quite gradually and then let it absorb in stages. It's kind of the slow cook that gets the flavour and the texture. So what we need is to keep our stock warm whilst we gradually add it into the pan. So I've got this little pan here. I'm going to pour the rest of the stock that I've made into the pan and just put on a low heat just to keep that warm, because if it goes cold and we add it into our big pan, then we're going to keep lowering the temperature of the meal, which is going to mean that it's going to take longer to cook. So we need a second pint glass of stock. So I'll just do that now. Obviously, if you've got a measuring jug, then that's going to work better than a pint glass. Little bit to melt it. I always use a fork and kind of mash the stock cube until it's melted so that you don't get any lumps. And then I'll top up the glass with water and add that to our stock pan over here. And I'll put a lid on the stock pan as well, just to keep it warm. And then what we're going to do is just bit by bit, we'll let this cook until you can see that the moisture has been absorbed. So a couple of minutes, and then we add another tip of the stock into there. And while we're doing that, we're going to chop up the tomatoes as well. You might find that you need extra liquid or that you don't need all of this liquid. We will be checking the risotto as we go along to make sure that it's getting cooked the right amount. So don't worry about exact quantities. Just make sure you keep that stock nice and warm. And make sure that you don't let the risotto stick to that pan. So just a really low temperature. And what we'll see as it cooks and as we add the liquid is that the rice will puff up and get a little bit bigger, and it will start to cook it through. So I've got some cherry tomatoes. I'm going to chop them into quarters whilst I'm doing the risotto, and I'm going to add some herbs as well. About a teaspoon of herbs. These are just some mixed herbs, but you will find that most will work quite well. Basil, oregano, thyme. People do also make risottos with fish, so you would then maybe look at using more kind of dill and thyme for fish. But a mixed herb works really well with a vegetable or a bacon or a chicken risotto. I should also say that the stock cubes I used were vegetable ones, but chicken stock cubes will work really well with this as well. You get a great flavour with chicken stock cubes, so whatever you prefer or whatever you've got in your cupboard. So got our cherry tomatoes. I'm going to just add a little bit more stock because this is doing really well. And already you can see it's holding together and that water's been absorbed. If you have a ladle, this is a great time to use it. Otherwise, just pour a little bit of your hot water in here, give it a stir, and then leave that to absorb. And we want our tomatoes probably in quarters. I tend to like the things in the risotto to be fairly small, but it's completely up to you. You could put the tomatoes in whole, but they would get swollen and they would burst. So I think I'm just have them cut to begin with. And in terms of quantity, depending on your size of tomatoes, you probably want about 12. I'm going to cut 12 and then just see how it looks, and you can always add a couple of extra. You want to make sure that each portion has got a fair amount of tomato in, but you don't want it to be all tomato and no rice. So I would suggest about 12 of these little cherry tomatoes. I love the smell of tomatoes. Okay, let's give that another stir. It's really important that you don't get this stuck to the bottom of the pan, because not only will it mean that you lose rice, but it's really hard to clean a pan with rice stuck to the bottom of it. And you don't want any burnt flavours in here, so you do need to keep it moving. Okay, 2 more. Once you've made a risotto once or twice, you'll probably find that you want to experiment with what you put in there, and just try out using different ingredients, doing it different ways to suit what you and your family enjoy. I'm just adding a little bit more stock. Okay, so another thing that you can do whilst you're stirring and adding is to grate your cheese. So I've got this block of parmesan cheese. As I said, it's a really strong flavour, and it's what would be traditionally used with risotto. But if you've got some cheddar that you want to use up, that's absolutely fine as well. You can make your risotto without the cheese. If you don't like that flavour, I know some people really hate cheese. I'm quite a fan. It gives it also a bit more of a creamy texture, and it's just something that I've always enjoyed having. Keep stirring that. And you might find because your parmesan will be harder than cheddar, so if you have the smaller holes on your grater, you might find that it works better with those. That's usually for parmesan cheese, and then your cheddar is on the larger holes, but just see how you get on with that. And you want quite a decent amount of cheese for this. Potentially a whole block like this wouldn't be a bad thing. I'm going to grate half of the block. We're adding the parmesan cheese in the last stage of the cooking, so it melts through. What I'm going to do is add that cheese, but then when I serve it, I'm going to grate a little bit more cheese just on the top of it right at the end, just so that it melts and sits on top of the risotto. And I'm going to put you on pause while I finish this because it's quite time consuming. Okay, so in my pan, we've been cooking for about 8-10 minutes now, and I've added 3 small amounts of stock. You might be able to see that the rice is starting to get bigger. One thing as well that I should mention is with this recipe, the rice will climb up the side of the pan as you're cooking it. It's good to keep pushing it back down again because otherwise those grains at the side of the pan aren't going to cook, and you don't want to be eating your gorgeous creamy risotto and then find a couple of uncooked grains of rice in it to spoil the experience. So just keep pushing it back down the sides. So as I say, it's been cooking about 8 to 10 minutes, so I'm going to put the tomatoes in there now. So we want them to get hot and we want them to soften and sort of add the tomato juice into the rest of the recipe. So this is 10 cherry tomatoes chopped into quarters. And once you've stirred it, you'll be able to decide if you think you've put enough tomatoes in there or not, depending on what kind of amount of tomato you would like to have in each helping. This is my pan. I think I'm going to put a couple more, but I'm also going to add a bit more stock. You just have to keep going with stock because you don't want it to dry out. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to pop a couple more of these in. Okay, so here's my lovely bowl of parmesan. So that's probably about 75 grams of parmesan cheese, ready to put in a little while. This process of cooking, I find it usually takes about 20 minutes to get the liquid absorbed, but it will depend a little bit on the rice that you've used and also on the type of pan as to how the heat conducts. And you might find as well that it cooks slightly differently depending on what extra ingredients you put in there. So you just need to keep an eye on it. It will be worth the time, I promise. And what you then start to do as you're running out of liquid is you're just going to want to check it and see if the rice is cooked. That's the best way to tell. So just get a couple of grains out with a clean spoon from the middle. Don't burn your tongue, but you'll be able to tell if they're starting to cook. So those are soft enough for me to be able to bite, but I do still have to bite them. So I would say that is about halfway cooked. So it takes about 4 minutes for each batch of liquid to be absorbed if you do it in small quantities like this. So you need to stay nearby and keep stirring it and just keep adding the liquid. As you can see, because I've got this on a low heat, it's just simmering away. Again, keep an eye on your stock because you don't want it to boil or to dry out. You just want it to stay hot so that it can be absorbed. I'm going to put you on pause while I cook this for probably the next 8 minutes and just add 2 more lots of stock into it, and then I'll come back to you when it's nearly done. Okay, so I've added another 2 lots of stock to the pan. You might be able to see the colours are changing and it's getting bigger. The grains of rice are expanding, which is great. And where the tomatoes have sort of gone all soft and mixed in, it's given it a little bit of a tomatoey colour throughout, which is lovely. I'm just going to try the rice and see how it's getting on. I can see that it's bigger, but I need to know if it's getting cooked. That's brilliant. So that's nearly done now. I think we're probably on to about the right amount of stock. So I have about this much left. So if you remember, this started out at being 1 litre of stock. It isn't an exact science, but that should be about the right amount of stock for the 500 grams of rice that we've used. So I'm going to add half of that and give it a stir. And at this point in the process, you do just need to keep tasting the rice to check. You don't want it to turn completely soft and mushy, but you want it to be really cooked through. And just keep on making sure that you stir it through so that you aren't stuck on the bottom of the pan there. You might find, depending on your pan and your hob, that there are certain parts of it that get hotter than others. I've got an electric hob, which I'm not a huge fan of because it doesn't heat very evenly. So I have a certain spot which gets a bit hotter than everywhere else. I have to just be aware of. I'm going to leave that now for 4 minutes just to absorb that moisture, and then I'm going to do the taste test again. And in our last stage, we're going to add our peas. Garden peas, they can either be frozen or in a tin. These ones were frozen, so I've just defrosted them. They don't need to be cooked because they'll cook in the risotto, but you do need them to be defrosted. And we'll also add the cheese, and we'll add a little bit more butter, and we'll add salt and pepper too. But we want to know that the rice is cooked so that it's the right texture before we put those things in, so that we don't overcook them. So I will be back in 3 minutes. Okay, so we have absorbed most of the moisture here, and I think this might be done. Let's have a taste. That's fantastic. So you'll be able to tell when your rice is cooked because it won't be chewy. What we're going to do now is add our peas and some salt and pepper. We add this nearer the end because it's easier to tell how much it will need. The stock cubes have quite a fair amount of salt in them, so you don't usually need very much salt when you're using a stock cube, but that's another reason why you need to taste, just so you can work out how much to add in there. As I said, the peas don't really need to be in there for long, which is why we're adding them at the end, because we don't want them to go to mush. We just want them to heat through. I've suggested for the quantity that you just want 1 tin of garden peas, or if you're not using a tin, you're probably going for about 200 grams. But again, go with sight. How many peas do you want in your risotto? You'll be able to tell by looking at it. And I've got this tiny little bit of stock left. I'm just going to add that last little bit to finish us off. And I'm going to add a final knob of butter. This, just putting this in at the end, just gives it a creaminess. So final knob of butter at the end. You don't have to put this in. If you're worried about using too much butter because of the fat content, then you don't need to put that in. On the